You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for September 11th, 2020. This week, COVID, ESC Recap Part 2 with icosapent ethyl, sudden cardiac death, and antiplatelet drugs after ACS in the elderly. First up, as always, is COVID. I'll say it's still bad. This week, we heard news that the Oxford group had to pause a trial of its vaccine due to an adverse effect in a single patient. Dr. Fauci called it unfortunate. When you read the news stories and reactions on this, you could almost feel the disappointment. People are so tired of COVID. The heretofore good news on vaccines had created a sense of optimism that was deflated. But it reminds me of the slides that I show at the beginning of my talks on medical conservatism. That is that medical progress, my friends, is hard. The magic bullets, the low NNT treatments like clean water and sanitation, antibiotics, pacemakers, HIV meds, insulin, these have been discovered. Most progress, especially that what we make in cardiology, is marginal and slow. COVID is a bad virus, but 99+% of people with it survive, and this creates a seriously high bar for safe vaccine development. One other comment on COVID is I saw a tweet about Jeff Bezos of Amazon this week. The statistic in this tweet was that if Jeff Bezos gave all 876,000 Amazon employees a $105,000 bonus, he'd be left with exactly as much money as he had at the start of the pandemic. Of course, this is because the stock of Amazon has gone up so much in the last year. Now, many in the thread questioned how society can allow someone to get that rich. But what it made me think of was how hard the pandemic has been on working people. Think about the downtown areas that we used to visit during medical conventions. Think about McCormick Place in Chicago. They had 30,000 people a weekend every weekend. All these people spending money in the airlines, restaurants, the gig workers, the custodians, the bartenders, etc. This despair of having your life shredded by job loss, I think, is underrated by public health key opinion leaders. I mean, my Twitter feed, there are graphs of how we're doing on this virus and this and that, how good other countries are doing. And of course, by saying this, I'm not saying letting it rip and going back to conventions and big sports venues. I'm just thinking about being a little bit more compassionate for the less well-off who have struggled during the pandemic. Next topic today is on icosapent ethyl, or VASEPA. At ESC, Dr. Matthew Budoff from the Harbor-UCLA program presented results of a study called EVAPORATE. Now, this was an 80-patient RCT of icosapent ethyl, IPE, versus placebo. Patients in this trial had to have some degree of coronary artery disease, and the placebo group here was given the same placebo as it was in REDUCE-IT, which was mineral oil. That's controversial. The authors used CT to measure changes in plaque volume in either arm, and the purpose of the experiment was to help explain the massive effect size in the REDUCE-IT trial. Remember that REDUCE-IT was a large RCT of icosapent ethyl added to statin, and it was shown to reduce total cardiovascular outcome events by 32%. Now that was controversial because A, buckets of fish oil trials before it had failed to show any effect. B, the effect size was so huge and beyond expectations. And C, the placebo in the trial included mineral oil. Now that was to protect blinding as fish oil pills are distinctive. And that placebo group had substantial increases in non-HDL cholesterol, which raised the question of whether IPE was a great drug or the placebo was harmful. Now the proponents of icosapent ethyl say its benefits stem from its higher dose and also that it's pure EPA formula. Remember, no DHA in icosapent ethyl. In this trial, the 80-patient trial, patients underwent serial CT scans and a final scan at 18 months. The primary endpoint was change in low attenuation plaque volume at 18 months between the IPE group and the placebo groups, and the top-line results were positive for icosapent ethyl. Low attenuation plaque volume decreased by 17%, while in the placebo it more than doubled. The authors concluded that, yes, IPE causes regression of low attenuation plaque, and this regression may be why the icosapent ethyl pill really did well in the REDUCE-IT trial. That paper sailed through editorial and peer review and was published in the European Heart Journal, but it did not, however, pass the much harder test of peer review by the public and on Twitter. First on Twitter, Dr. Tanboga, a cardiologist and statistician from Turkey, questioned how the changes in low attenuation plaque was even possible clinically. Then Professor Daryl Francis commented that there were in fact large differences in baseline characteristics, and he worried that this might be because there was not blinded assessment of the data. Francis also noted statistically significant plaque progression in the placebo group. Increase in total atheroma volume in the placebo arm was not 11%, but rather, if you scaled it up, more like 151%. And he wrote that either that's a mistake in the measurement or the placebo is harmful, because I can't see how this is sustainable. He then said, why isn't everyone dead from coronary disease if plaque is progressing that fast? Similarly, in the news story, Steve Nissen from the Cleveland Clinic also commented. He said, I've published more than a dozen regression and progression trials and have never seen anything like this in a placebo group ever. He said, if this was a clean placebo, why would this happen in such a short amount of time? Now, the primary investigator, Dr. Budoff, rejected these concerns, and he cited previous work his group has done, which shows that the mineral oil placebo does not affect plaque any differently compared to a cellulose placebo. Patrice Wendling has an excellent recap, and it includes links to Professor Francis's Twitter threads, which are enlightening. My take-home is to again revert to the medically conservative view. The REDUCE-IT trial had compelling but surprising results. The question of harm from the placebo mineral oil arm is a legitimate one. EVAPORATE data actually strengthens the argument that mineral oil placebo may be problematic. So the answer, I think, is before accepting this new drug, icosapent ethyl, is to have another large cardiovascular outcomes trial, which is normal. I mean, the SGLT2 inhibitors, TAVR, ICDs, beta blockers were all shown beneficial in multiple trials. With REDUCE-IT and EVAPORATE, we just don't know. Okay, next topic is sudden death. In fact, how sudden is sudden death? One of the rules of cardiology we were taught decades ago is that about 1 in 5 people learn they have heart disease when they have sudden death. The corollary of that, of course, is that people who present with heart failure, angina, and MI were actually luckier. And as a cardiologist, I've often recited this rule. Well, my editor and the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology site director, Tricia Ward, has always pushed back on this, and she has said, John, there are studies that show many of these patients who have had sudden death actually had warning signs. Sudden death, therefore, may not be as sudden and unexpected as we had previously thought. A paper presented at ESC from Danish researchers actually support Tricia's view. And of course, this is an important topic because the best way to reduce death from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is to not have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in the first place. The Danish authors examined contacts within their healthcare system in the weeks and years before an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. They used a registry from 2001 to 2014, and this allowed them to look at healthcare contacts with either a GP or hospital in the time before the cardiac arrest. And of course, they have a matched control group. There were about 28,000 patients who had out-of-hospital cardiac arrest over this time period. And the top-line results of this paper are shocking. Nearly 17,000 of these 28,000, or 58%, contacted their GP or hospital within 2 weeks before the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. This compared to only 14% of the general population during this period. Now, the reasons for hospital contacts were heterogeneous. Ischemic heart disease, heart failure were the most common. But the obvious conclusion from this paper is that there is an increase in contacts within the healthcare system in the time period before one has a cardiac arrest. Journalist Marlene Busco has a nice news recap on this paper, and in it she cites a paper from researchers in Ontario, Canada, that actually found that more than 1 in 4 patients there were assessed in the emergency department within 90 days of their cardiac arrest, and I'll link to that paper. I look forward to the Danish paper. It's still just an abstract, but this has big implications for our field. Think about it. It teaches, or should I say, tempts us to think that sudden cardiac death is not just a stochastic thing, a random event that just happens, and it's mostly out of our control. This data would suggest that many people have warning symptoms that if they were heeded or evaluated more carefully, then perhaps we could reduce the death rate from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. But on the other hand, whenever you look at case control studies like this, you don't have a comparator group of the gazillions of people who present with vague symptoms that do not go on to have a sudden death event. So heightened awareness, more zealous workups could lead to a tsunami of overdiagnosis and overtreatment and a iatrogenic harm. So in sum, my take of this data is 1, obviously, be more humble about our rules. Secondly, have these observations in the back of our minds when seeing high-risk people who have vague symptoms. And finally, certainly not go overboard with our overzealous workups. The next topic today is caring for the elderly who have had PCI for acute coronary syndrome, or MI. Last year, when I visited Edinburgh, Scotland, one of the senior physicians there was mad as heck that the NHS had decided to mandate that the reversible, expensive, twice-daily dose ticagrelor should be used over clopidogrel in patients who've had PCI. I can't remember the totality of his argument, but it was essentially that if there were benefits from ticagrelor over clopidogrel, the costs were simply too great, especially on the scale of the entire NHS. His was a value judgment, and he felt like that there were many better things to spend dollars on. And indeed, in my group, there is wide variation of antiplatelet drugs after PCI. Some of my interventional colleagues are conservative, and they still favor clopidogrel in most patients, while others favor the newer agents. Now, before I tell you about a nifty ESC presentation and simultaneous publication in Circ, this was from the Sweetheart investigators who studied elderly patients who were treated with PCI for STEMI with either ticagrelor or clopidogrel. We should briefly go over the landmark Plateau trial. Plateau was published in 2009 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it compared ticagrelor to clopidogrel in about 20,000 patients who had PCI and stent after ACS. And indeed, ticagrelor reduced the composite endpoint of CV death, MI, stroke by about 1.9%, in absolute terms 16%, in relative terms. Ticagrelor also reduced death 1.4% lower, but no significant differences in the rates of major bleeding. However, central to this story in this new paper are 3 facts. First, the median age of patients in this guideline-changing trial was a mere 61 years. Only 15% in Plateau were older than 75 years. And remember, secondly, RCTs enroll patients who are in general motivated and likely to be adherent to BID regimens. Ticagrelor is BID. Third, RCTs also have research nurses who arrange for follow-up, and patients get medications at no cost. Now to the Sweetheart study from ESC. This was elderly patients older than 80 recruited after an ACS between 2010 and 2017. 8.4 thousand were discharged on clopidogrel, 5.5 thousand discharged on ticagrelor. And remember, this was a non-randomized observational study, and as you would expect, patients who were on ticagrelor were sicker, they had more heart failure, more prior CV events, etc. Also, as you'd expect, in the unadjusted analysis, patients on ticagrelor had higher rates of death, MI, stroke. But after adjustment, the authors found no significant differences in a composite MACE endpoint, major adverse cardiac events endpoint. But ticagrelor was associated with a 17% higher rate of death and a 48% higher risk of bleeding. Now, this was counterbalanced by a lower risk of MI events, 20% lower, and stroke events, hazard ratio 0.72. So we have to be careful in analyzing this because it's a non-randomized comparison. And as I say almost every week on TWIC, that even though the authors performed statistical adjustments, the decision to use one drug over another was a clinician's, not random. So it's possible, and it's even likely, that inherently higher risk patients got ticagrelor, and then that confounder might account for the higher rates of death. But nonetheless, I think this is a pretty strong signal for an observational study. Consider that a recently published non-inferiority RCT from the Netherlands, this was called Popular Age, and I'll link to it. This compared ticagrelor and clopidogrel in patients older than 70 who had had non-STEMI. Here, the Dutch authors found that in these older patients who presented with non-STEMI, clopidogrel led to fewer bleeding events without an increase in the combined endpoint of all-cause death, MI, stroke, and bleeding. Now, another finding that is hard to counter is that the BID dosing of ticagrelor is likely going to perform better in trials than it would in the real world. And I say this, and 20 and 30-year-old listeners may not have had the opportunity to have to take medicines twice a day. But I can testify to you that it's pretty hard. I have mild to moderate asthma and a fair amount of wheezing, and I still often forget to use my puffer. Now consider that once a metal cage is placed into a coronary artery, blocking platelet function is not as optional as taking a puffer for mild asthma. So in summary, I don't pretend to be an expert on choosing platelet inhibitors after coronary interventions. It's a complicated topic. But this paper, the Sweetheart paper, and the ideas it brings up are worthy. The authors write a terrific concluding sentence. They write that there is a need for an adequately powered randomized study examining the effects of potent antiplatelets in the elderly population. The editorialists also do well. They say that the optimal selection of platelet inhibitors in elderly patients after MI should account for a multitude of factors that need to be weighed up, as this choice can make a difference. And of course, I add this topic to the podcast because it transcends just the choice of drugs after ACS. That's the specific issue. The general issue is this paper makes you think about the external validity of data collected in carefully done clinical trials that enroll mostly young patients. Now finally, speaking of evidence translation, I wrote a column on the biggest trial from the HRS meeting this spring, and this was the Praetorian trial, which was an RCT comparing the subcutaneous ICD to traditional transvenous ICDs. I've spoken on this topic before in a podcast, so I won't repeat myself. I will say that I shared this column with one of my EP groups and received both positive and negative feedback, which I like. Another feature on the site that's worth a listen to is Dr. Eric Topol's conversation with vaccine development expert Dr. Paul Offit. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, please, if you like this podcast, it really helps if you take the time to give us a rating, write us a review, tell your friends, and that way others can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.